The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as Camilla stood at her bedroom window, watching the changing of the guards' ceremony below. The red-coated soldiers moved with precision, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance she had witnessed countless times before. Yet today, something felt different. There was an unusual tension in the air, a heaviness that seemed to press against the ornate windows of her private chambers. Camilla Parker Bowles, now queen consort, had never imagined her life would take such dramatic turns. Born into aristocracy, she had always moved in royal circles, but the path to her current position had been anything but smooth. The woman who now held one of the most scrutinized titles in the world had endured decades of public criticism, media storms, and personal challenges that would have broken many others. Her marriage to Charles had been a love story that spanned decades, beginning long before either of them wore crowns. They had met in their youth, when the world was simpler and their futures seemed more predictable. But royal duty had separated them, sending Charles to marry Diana while Camilla wed Andrew Parker Bowles. For years, they lived parallel lives, fulfilling their obligations to family and crown while maintaining a connection that neither time nor circumstance could completely sever. The phone rang sharply, interrupting her thoughts. Camilla turned from the window, her silk morning gown rustling softly as she moved across the Persian carpet. The caller ID showed her private secretary's number, but when she answered, the voice on the other end was unfamiliar and urgent. "Your Majesty, there's been an incident. The king has collapsed during his morning walk. He's been rushed to the hospital, and the medical team is with him now." The words hit her like physical blows. Camilla gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white against the gold receiver. "What do you mean collapsed? Is he conscious? What are the doctors saying?" "Ma'am, I don't have complete details yet, but I've been instructed to inform you immediately. A car is being prepared to take you to the hospital. The Prime Minister has been notified, and security protocols are being activated." Camilla's mind raced as she processed this information. Charles had been in good health recently, though the stress of his new role as king had been taking its toll. At 75, he was no longer a young man, and the weight of the crown had aged him visibly in the months since his mother's passing. She dressed quickly in a navy blue suit, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened her pearl necklace. This piece of jewelry had been a gift from Charles on their wedding day, and she wore it whenever she needed to feel his presence close to her. As she prepared to leave, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman staring back had silver hair, perfectly styled despite the early hour, eyes that held both strength and vulnerability, and the bearing of someone who had learned to carry herself with dignity even in the darkest moments. The ride to the hospital passed in a blur of London streets and concerned faces of her security detail. Camilla stared out the window, remembering another frantic journey years ago when Charles had been thrown from his horse during a polo match. That time, his injuries had been minor, but the fear she had felt then was nothing compared to the cold terror gripping her now. At the hospital, she was escorted through private corridors away from the gathering media. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the sound of hurried footsteps created an atmosphere of controlled chaos. Dr. Harrison, the royal physician, met her outside the intensive care unit, his expression grave but professional. "Your Majesty, the king suffered what appears to be a significant cardiac event. We've stabilized him for now, but the next 24 hours will be critical. He's conscious but weak, and we're running comprehensive tests to determine the extent of the damage." Camilla nodded, trying to maintain her composure. "May I see him?" "Of course, but please keep the visit brief. He needs rest." Charles lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. Machines surrounded him, their soft beeping providing a rhythmic soundtrack to her worst fears. His face was pale, but his eyes were alert when they met hers. She took his hand, careful not to disturb the 4 lines. "My darling," she whispered, leaning close to his ear. "You gave me quite a scare." Charles managed a weak smile. "Can't get rid of me that easily," he whispered back, his voice hoarse but still carrying the warmth that had drawn her to him all those years ago. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, her presence seeming to calm him as much as it comforted her. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of helicopters as news crews gathered, already spinning the story for the evening broadcasts. "Camilla," Charles said suddenly, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "If something happens to me—" "Nothing is going to happen," she interrupted firmly. "You're going to recover, and we're going to continue this journey together. But if it does," he continued, his eyes serious, "promise me you'll remember who you are. You're not just my wife anymore. You're queen consort. That means something, even if others try to tell you differently." Before she could respond, Dr. Harrison appeared at the bedside, indicating that the visit needed to end. Camilla kissed Charles's forehead gently, inhaling the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the clinical smell of the hospital. As she left the room, her mind was already working through the implications of Charles's words. The line of succession was clear, but the transition of power during a medical crisis was always complicated. William would inherit the throne if his father couldn't continue, but until that happened officially, many responsibilities would fall to her. The next few days passed in a haze of hospital visits, meetings with government officials, and carefully worded press releases. Charles's condition stabilized, but remained serious. The doctors spoke of cardiac procedures and lengthy recovery times, while the media speculated about everything from abdication to constitutional crises. Camilla found herself thrust into a role she hadn't fully prepared for, serving as the primary liaison between the monarchy and the government during the king's incapacitation. She attended briefings with the prime minister, received updates from the Commonwealth representatives, and made decisions about which royal engagements could be postponed or reassigned. The pressure was immense. Every word she spoke was analyzed, every decision scrutinized by both supporters and critics. The British public, still adjusting to her as queen consort, watched her every move with intense interest. Some admired her composure under pressure, while others questioned whether she had the authority to make the choices she was making. One evening, as she sat in her study reviewing documents that required the royal seal, she received an unexpected visitor. Sir Edmund Hardcastle, the Lord Chamberlain, entered with an expression that immediately put her on alert. "Your Majesty, we need to discuss a delicate matter," he began, settling into the chair across from her desk. "There have been some concerns raised about the extent of your current activities." "What kind of concerns?" Camilla asked, though she suspected she already knew the direction this conversation was heading. "Some members of Parliament, as well as certain royal advisors, feel that perhaps you've taken on responsibilities that might be better handled through other channels until the king recovers fully." The implication was clear, though diplomatically stated. There were those who believed she was overstepping her role, that a woman who had once been the subject of intense controversy had no business making decisions that affected the monarchy's future. "Sir Edmund," Camilla replied carefully, "everything I've done has been in consultation with the appropriate officials and in the best interests of the crown. The king himself asked me to ensure continuity during his recovery." "Of course, Your Majesty. However, appearances matter, and there are those who feel that certain decisions might carry more weight if they came through Prince William's office." Camilla felt a familiar anger rising within her, the same feeling she had experienced during the worst days of media persecution decades earlier. The suggestion that her authority was somehow lesser than William's, despite her official position, touched on every insecurity and criticism she had faced since becoming part of the royal family. "I understand your concerns," she said finally, "but I have a responsibility to fulfill my role as queen consort. That includes supporting the monarchy during challenging times." That night, alone in her chambers, Camilla reflected on the conversation. She had spent years proving herself worthy of her position, working tirelessly on charitable causes, supporting Charles through his own periods of doubt and criticism, and gradually winning over a public that had once viewed her as an interloper. Yet here she was, facing the same fundamental question that had followed her throughout her royal journey. Did she truly belong? Was she really accepted as a full member of the institution she had married into? Or would she always be seen as an outsider who had somehow maneuvered her way into a position she didn't deserve? The next morning brought news that Charles was showing signs of improvement. His doctors were cautiously optimistic about his recovery, though they emphasized that it would be a long process. The relief Camilla felt was overwhelming, but it was tinged with the realization that his illness had exposed fault lines in her own position that she hadn't fully recognized. As she prepared for another day of hospital visits and official duties, she made a decision that would shape everything that followed. She would not step back or diminish her role to satisfy those who questioned her authority. Charles had asked her to remember who she was, and she was Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, with all the responsibilities and privileges that title carried. The woman who had survived decades of public scrutiny, who had waited patiently for love to triumph over duty, who had proven her worth through service and dedication, was not about to let fear or political maneuvering diminish her position now. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same determination that had brought her this far. Standing once again at her window, watching the guards below, Camilla felt a steel resolve settling into her bones. The conversation with Sir Edmund had been a warning, but it was also a call to action. If others questioned her authority, she would demonstrate it. If they doubted her commitment, she would prove them wrong. The story of Camilla, Queen Consort, was still being written, and she intended to be the author of her own chapters. 3 weeks had passed since Charles's hospitalization, and while his recovery was progressing steadily, the palace had become a battleground of subtle power struggles and competing interests. Camilla found herself navigating an increasingly complex web of relationships as various factions within the royal household and government began positioning themselves for different scenarios. The morning started like many others recently, with a briefing from her private secretary about the day's schedule and any urgent matters requiring her attention. But today brought an unexpected addition to her agenda, a private meeting with Prince William that had been requested through official channels rather than the informal family communication they normally used. Camilla prepared for this meeting with careful consideration of both her appearance and her approach. She chose a burgundy dress that conveyed authority while remaining appropriate for a family discussion, and she spent time reviewing recent decisions and their justifications. The relationship between stepmother and stepson had always been complex, built on mutual respect, but lacking the natural bond that blood relationships typically provided. William arrived precisely on time, his bearing formal despite the family nature of their connection. At 41, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for his eventual role as king his entire life. His marriage to Catherine had provided him with stability and public support, and his children represented the future of the monarchy in a way that resonated powerfully with the British people. Camilla, he began, using her first name rather than her title in a way that immediately signaled the personal nature of their conversation. I wanted to speak with you about some concerns that have been raised regarding the current arrangements. Of course, she replied, gesturing for him to sit in one of the comfortable chairs near the fireplace. I assume this relates to my activities while your father recovers. Partly, yes. There are some who feel that certain decisions would benefit from broader consultation, particularly those that might set precedents for future situations. Camilla recognized the diplomatic language for what it was, a polite way of suggesting that she should step back and allow others to take the lead. The irony wasn't lost on her that this conversation was taking place just as Charles had begun making significant improvements and talking about returning to limited duties. William, she said, choosing her words carefully, I want you to know that everything I've done has been with the best interests of the monarchy in mind. Your father specifically asked me to maintain continuity during his absence. I understand that, and I appreciate your dedication. However, we need to consider how these arrangements appear to the public and to our constitutional experts. There are questions about the authority of the Queen Consort to make certain decisions that traditionally would fall to the heir or to a formally appointed regent. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with both parties maintaining careful politeness while addressing fundamental questions about power, authority, and the future direction of the royal family. William's concerns were not entirely unreasonable. The British constitutional system did have specific protocols for these situations, and public perception was always a crucial consideration for the monarchy's long-term stability. Yet Camilla couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than constitutional niceties. The underlying message seemed to be that her position, while officially recognized, was still viewed by some as provisional or secondary to the real members of the royal family. After William left, Camilla spent time walking through the palace gardens, a habit she had developed during stressful periods. The autumn air was crisp, and the changing leaves provided a beautiful backdrop for her thoughts. She reflected on the conversation and its implications, trying to separate her personal feelings from the legitimate institutional concerns that had been raised. Her phone buzzed with a text from Charles. "Feeling much better today. Doctors say I might be able to attend the Commonwealth meeting next week, even if just briefly. Miss our evening talks." The message brought both relief and additional complexity to her situation. Charles's recovery meant that the current arrangements would soon be resolved naturally, but it also raised questions about what would happen in future health crises or other situations where his availability might be limited. That afternoon brought another challenging conversation, this time with the Prime Minister's representative. The meeting took place in the formal reception room, with its portraits of previous monarchs looking down on the proceedings as if judging the current generation's handling of royal traditions. "Your Majesty," began Sir Robert Henley, the cabinet secretary, "the government has been reviewing the protocols for situations like the current one, and we wanted to discuss some recommendations for future consideration." Camilla listened as he outlined proposed changes that would formalize the process for handling royal incapacitation, including clearer lines of authority and more specific roles for different family members. The recommendations were presented as general improvements to the system, but she understood that they were directly related to questions about her recent activities. "These suggestions seem reasonable," she replied diplomatically, "though I would want to ensure that any changes preserve the flexibility needed to respond to unique circumstances." "Absolutely, Your Majesty. The goal is clarity, not rigidity." The subtext of the conversation was becoming increasingly clear. While no one was directly challenging her authority, there was a coordinated effort to establish boundaries and limitations that would prevent similar situations from arising in the future. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Her current role was acceptable as an emergency measure, but it shouldn't be seen as a precedent. That evening, Camilla visited Charles in his private study, where he was working on correspondence despite his doctor's advice to limit his activities. He looked much improved from those first frightening days in the hospital, though she could see the fatigue in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. "How are you feeling about returning to duties?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his desk. "Eager, but realistic," he replied, setting down his pen. "The doctors want me to start slowly, which is probably wise. But I'm concerned about what I've been hearing regarding your situation." "What have you heard?" Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression growing serious. "There seem to be some who question whether you've overstepped during my absence. I want you to know that I completely support everything you've done, and I'm proud of how you've handled these responsibilities." "Thank you, darling. That means everything to me. But I'm also realistic about the politics involved. There are legitimate constitutional questions, and there are those who will always question my position." "The constitutional questions have easy answers," Charles said firmly. "You acted within established protocols and with appropriate consultation. As for those who question your position..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You are Queen Consort. That's not an honorary title or a temporary designation. It carries real authority and responsibility." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Charles's private secretary entered with an urgent expression that immediately put both of them on alert. "Your Majesty, I apologize for the interruption, but there's been a development. The story about the king's health and recent palace arrangements has leaked to the press, and they're planning a significant exposé for tomorrow's editions." Camilla felt her stomach drop. Media attention was always challenging, but a negative story during this sensitive period could damage both her reputation and the monarchy's stability. The timing was particularly unfortunate, just as Charles was preparing to return to his duties, and the crisis seemed to be resolving. "What exactly are they reporting?" Charles asked. "The main narrative seems to be about power struggles within the royal family during your illness, with particular focus on questions about the Queen Consort's authority and decision-making. They're presenting it as a constitutional crisis that was hidden from the public." Over the next hour, they worked with the communications team to develop a response strategy. The palace would release a statement emphasizing the king's recovery and the smooth functioning of royal duties throughout his illness. They would also arrange for Charles to make a brief public appearance to demonstrate his improved health and put speculation to rest. But Camilla knew that the damage would extend beyond whatever the newspapers printed. The story would reinforce existing doubts about her position and provide ammunition for those who prefer to see the monarchy's authority concentrated in the direct line of succession. Late that night, unable to sleep, she found herself in the palace library, surrounded by biographies of previous queens and historical accounts of royal crises. She read about other women who had faced similar challenges to their authority, from Queen Mary during her husband's mental illness to the Queen Mother during various constitutional upheavals. What struck her most was how often questions of female authority within a monarchy came down to fundamental issues of legitimacy and belonging. Even queens who had been born into royal families sometimes faced challenges to their decision-making power, while those who had married into the family often found their positions questioned during times of crisis. The next morning brought the expected media storm. The headlines were dramatic, but not as devastating as she had feared. Palace power struggle, Queen Consort's constitutional challenge, and monarchy's hidden crisis. The articles raised legitimate questions about royal protocols while also indulging in speculation about personal relationships and power dynamics. Charles insisted on holding a brief press conference to address the speculation directly. Standing beside him as he spoke to the assembled journalists, Camilla was struck by how naturally he commanded authority even while clearly still recovering from his illness. His words were measured but firm as he praised her handling of responsibilities during his absence and dismissed suggestions of any constitutional impropriety. "The Queen Consort has fulfilled her duties with distinction and complete propriety," he stated clearly. "Any suggestion otherwise is both unfounded and unfair." The press conference helped contain the immediate crisis, but Camilla understood that the underlying issues remained unresolved. Her position within the royal family was secure as long as Charles was king, but the recent events had exposed vulnerabilities that would likely resurface in future challenging situations. As they left the press conference together, Charles squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You've handled all of this magnificently," he whispered. "Don't let anyone make you doubt that." But privately, Camilla knew that the real test was yet to come. The next few months would determine whether she had truly established herself as an integral part of the monarchy's leadership or whether she would always be seen as someone whose authority was derivative and temporary. The woman who had waited decades to become queen was now discovering that earning the title was only the beginning of the battle for recognition, and respect. 6 months had passed since Charles's health crisis, and the monarchy had settled into what appeared to be a normal rhythm. The king had made a full recovery and resumed his duties, while Camilla had returned to her traditional role as queen consort, focusing on her charitable work and public engagements. However, beneath the surface of royal routine, tensions that had emerged during those difficult weeks continued to simmer. The morning that would change everything began with what seemed like a routine engagement. Camilla was scheduled to open a new women's shelter in Manchester, one of many facilities supported by her domestic violence awareness charity. It was work she was passionate about, having spent years building relationships with organizations that helped vulnerable women rebuild their lives. As her car approached the shelter, Camilla noticed the unusual size of the crowd gathered outside. What she had expected to be a modest ceremony had drawn hundreds of people, including a significant media presence that seemed disproportionate for a local charity event. Her protection officer, Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews, moved closer as they prepared to exit the vehicle. "Ma'am, we're seeing some unusual activity in the crowd," D.I. Matthews said quietly. "Nothing threatening, but there seems to be some kind of organized demonstration mixed in with the supporters." As Camilla stepped from the car, she was immediately struck by the energy of the gathering. About half the crowd was clearly there to support the shelter opening, holding welcome signs and flowers. But the other half carried different messages entirely. Signs that read, "Not our queen," "Illegitimate authority," and "Respect the true succession." For a moment, Camilla felt transported back to the darkest days of public hostility she had faced decades earlier. The familiar mixture of anger and hurt threatened to overwhelm her, but she drew on years of experience managing difficult public situations. She straightened her shoulders, smiled warmly at the supporters, and began walking toward the shelter entrance. "Your Majesty," called out one of the protesters, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression. "Do you really believe you have the right to represent the crown after what we witnessed during the king's illness?" The question hung in the air as journalists rushed forward, sensing a confrontation. Camilla paused, considering her options. Protocol dictated that she should ignore the provocation and continue with her scheduled activities, but something in the woman's tone sparked a deeper response. "I believe," Camilla said clearly, her voice carrying across the crowd, "that service to the people of this country is what gives anyone the right to represent the crown. That service doesn't depend on birth or bloodline. It depends on dedication and commitment." The crowd's reaction was immediate and divided. Supporters cheered while protesters grew more vocal in their objections. Signs waved more vigorously, and the atmosphere became increasingly charged. D.I. Matthews stepped closer, her hand moving instinctively toward a radio. "You weren't chosen by us," another voice called out. "You chose yourself through manipulation and scheming." The accusation was brutal in its directness, echoing criticisms that had followed Camilla throughout her relationship with Charles. The suggestion that she had somehow manipulated her way into her position touched on every insecurity and piece of historical baggage that still haunted her public image. "I chose love," Camilla replied, her voice remaining steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "And I was chosen by the king, who was chosen by constitutional tradition and the will of the people through their elected representatives. If you have issues with that system, I suggest you take them up at Parliament." The exchange was being captured by dozens of cameras and would be broadcast around the world within hours. Camilla knew that her words would be analyzed, criticized, and debated by constitutional experts, royal commentators, and the general public. But in that moment, she felt a clarity of purpose that had been missing since Charles's illness. She continued toward the shelter, stopping to speak with supporters and ignoring the continued shouts from protesters. Inside, the ceremony proceeded as planned, with Camilla delivering a speech about the importance of supporting women who had escaped abusive situations. Her voice was strong and confident, showing no sign of being rattled by the confrontation outside. "These women," she said, looking directly at the shelter residents who had chosen to attend, "have shown incredible courage in rebuilding their lives. They remind us that true strength isn't about the circumstances of our birth, but about how we respond to challenges and how we choose to serve others." The words carried multiple meanings, addressing both the immediate audience and the broader questions about her own position that had been raised outside. After the ceremony, as she toured the facility and met with staff and residents, Camilla felt a renewed sense of purpose in her work. The drive back to London was quiet, with D.I. Matthews occasionally speaking in her radio to coordinate with other security personnel. Camilla stared out the window at the passing countryside, knowing that the day's events would have significant repercussions for her position and the monarchy's reputation. Her phone rang as they approached the outskirts of London. Charles's voice was concerned, but supportive when she answered. "I've been watching the news coverage," he said. "You handled that situation with remarkable dignity. I'm proud of you." "Thank you, darling. But I suspect this is just the beginning. The footage is already everywhere, and the commentary is predictably mixed. "We'll deal with whatever comes next together," Charles assured her. "Your response was perfect, principled, but not defensive, clear about your position without being confrontational." That evening, as they watched the news coverage together, Camilla saw herself standing before the hostile crowd, her words being replayed and analyzed by experts across multiple channels. The consensus seemed to be that she had handled the confrontation well, but it had also opened up broader questions about public acceptance of the monarchy and the specific challenges facing someone in her unique position. The next few days brought a deluge of commentary, opinion pieces, and social media debate. Polls showed the country divided almost evenly between those who supported her response and those who felt she had overstepped by engaging with protesters rather than maintaining royal neutrality. Constitutional experts debated whether her comments about being chosen by the king were appropriate, while royal historians compared the incident to similar confrontations faced by previous queens. More significantly, the incident had awakened dormant opposition to her position that extended beyond the usual Republican critics of the monarchy. There were those who accepted the institution of the crown, but questioned whether someone with her particular history should hold such a prominent role within it. A week after the Manchester incident, Camilla received an unusual request for a meeting from the Archbishop of Canterbury. The head of the Church of England had always maintained a carefully neutral relationship with her, acknowledging her position while avoiding the more controversial aspects of her path to it. "Your Majesty," the Archbishop began as they sat in his study at Lambeth Palace, "I wanted to discuss some concerns that have been raised within the church hierarchy regarding recent events." Camilla listened as he outlined objections from various church leaders who felt that her confrontational approach with protesters was inappropriate for someone in her position. The church had always struggled with questions about divorce and remarriage within the royal family, and some clergy saw the recent incident as evidence of deeper problems with her role. "Archbishop," Camilla replied carefully, "I believe I spoke truthfully about the nature of royal service and my own commitment to that service. If my defense of constitutional principles is seen as controversial, perhaps the problem lies not with my words, but with misconceptions about my role." "Your position is indeed unique," he acknowledged, "and that uniqueness creates challenges for those of us tasked with providing spiritual guidance to the crown." The public confrontation has raised questions about the appropriate boundaries for royal expression. The conversation continued for over an hour, touching on issues of moral authority, public service, and the complex relationship between personal history and institutional responsibility. While the Archbishop didn't directly challenge her position, his concerns reflected broader unease within traditional institutions about the implications of her increasingly assertive approach to her role. That same week brought another significant development. A group of prominent MPs from across party lines issued a formal statement calling for clarification of the Queen Consort's constitutional role, particularly in relation to situations like Charles's recent illness. While carefully worded to avoid direct criticism, the statement clearly reflected ongoing discomfort with the precedents that had been set during that period. The statement read, in part, "While we have great respect for Her Majesty the Queen Consort and her dedication to public service, recent events have highlighted the need for clearer protocols regarding the distribution of royal responsibilities during times of crisis. The British people deserve transparency about who holds what authority within our constitutional system." Camilla knew that behind the diplomatic language lay a more fundamental challenge to her legitimacy and authority. The Manchester incident had provided a focal point for various sources of opposition that had been building since Charles's illness, creating a perfect storm of constitutional, religious, and popular opposition to her expanding role. Yet rather than feeling defeated, she experienced something closer to liberation. For decades, she had tried to win over critics through careful behavior, charitable work, and avoiding controversy. The recent events had shown that no amount of good behavior would satisfy some critics, freeing her to focus on those who did support her position and the work she believed was important. Standing in her private study, surrounded by photographs of the charities and causes she had championed, Camilla made a decision that would define the rest of her time as Queen Consort. She would not retreat from public engagement, or apologize for defending her position. If there were those who questioned her authority, she would demonstrate it through action rather than trying to convince them through words. The woman who had survived decades of public criticism and emerged to claim her rightful place was not about to be diminished by a new wave of opposition. The confrontation in Manchester had been a declaration of her intention to be more than a ceremonial figure, and she was prepared to face whatever consequences that decision might bring. Her phone buzzed with a message from her private secretary. Palace has received over 3,000 letters of support following Manchester. Shall I prepare a public response? Camilla smiled as she typed back, yes, and schedule more public engagements. It's time to show them exactly what a queen consort can accomplish when she stops apologizing for existing.